Hey,
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 we're
calling Rick
live.
Byer. Yeah, we are, but you don't look. Wow, calling Rick Byer, and I have no idea where.
I am in Wiscasset, Maine. Beautiful
You,
downtown Wiscasset, Maine.
do they not have
And
houses and
yeah,
roofs in Wisconsin, Maine, or is
well,
it?
well, as I explained earlier, we are staying in an Airbnb. We're up here for the weekend, and the Wi-Fi there's atrocious. So I am outside the public library. So our show today brought to you not only by Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, but by the Wiscasset Public Library. We so
There you
appreciate your
go.
free Wi-Fi, guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
And
we do.
it's a little bit rainy here in Wiscasset, which is why I'm wearing my rain jacket. This is so much fun. But this is kind of what it looks like on a slightly sunnier day. These are photos from
Yeah,
yesterday. So this is kind of where I'm hanging out. That's the church that's just around the corner. So
very nice.
um, yeah, a reminder to everybody that we're here. We may travel the globe. I didn't even ask where you are calling, Chris Anderson. That place looks
Well,
very unfamiliar. Where is it?
yeah, I'm actually home. I'm back in London
Oh
for
my
at least a
goodness.
week. Yeah,
I,
very nice.
no hotel in,
No,
some far-flung European capital.
where is that
Uh,
Novotel?
yeah, there, you'll be back there.
Nice.
Anyway, we're here each week, and today we're going to be talking about Cold War spies, treachery, betrayal, and more. I want to give a big thank you to everybody who supports this effort via Patreon, most especially our top shelf sponsors or patrons. You know who you are, but I'm going to show your names anyway. And
Oh yeah.
everybody who supports us on Patreon, thank you so much. We really do appreciate that. And you can be a Patreon supporter by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour and knowing that you too are supporting whatever the heck it is that we are doing. Chris, do you think we are ready, or do we need to stretch out a little bit more? Do you think we
No,
are
I
ready to
think
actually
I think
begin a
we have a lot to cover.
broadcast?
There we go. You ready?
Okay, give me a cue.
Wow.
That's today's bell. The,
That's a
the,
you've upped it up a notch there.
the bar is open.
The bar is open.
And everybody, today we are going to turn our attention to the Cold War and the real life equivalent of those John le Carré novels that many of you have probably read. 1950s and 1960s Cold War Spy versus Spy. And we're going to talk to Tim Tate, who's the author of a book. Tim is so into spying, Chris. Even his book has an alternate identity,
Ooh,
right?
look at that.
So in the U.S., it's called Agent Sniper. In Great Britain, it's called The Spy Who Was Left Out in the Cold, the direct takeoff there on John le Carré. And it tells of the rise and fall of Polish espionage officer Michael, you say, Chris,
Goleniewski.
Goleniewski, one of the CIA's most effective spies, and his shocking downfall. And our good friend Helen Fry calls the book a masterpiece. That's pretty good. Saying Tate lifts the lid on one of the most important and complex spy stories of World War II. And I should say that Tim Tate is a multiple award-winning documentary filmmaker, so I already like him, an investigative journalist, and over a career spanning more than 40 years, he has made more than 80 documentaries and written for many newspapers and authored 17 previous books. He lives in Wiltshire, if I'm saying that correctly. And let's bring on Tim Tate. Hey, Tim, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Tim.
So, you write in your book that Michael Goleniewski was Goleniewski. I'm never going to say it correctly. We call it an Agent Sniper from now on. Was the most important yet least understood spy of the early Cold War. So why important? Why misunderstood?
Important because no spy before, and I think since, has ever provided the West with the sheer volume of material that he provided. In total, he exposed to the West 1,693 communist spies operating deep inside Western governments and agencies. No one has ever done that before, and no one, I don't think, has ever achieved that volume of exposures since. So he was the man who exposed some of the biggest and most important spy rings of the era, working undercover largely for the West, at a time when it was incredibly dangerous to do so. He was risking his life every day for 3 years. There is really no equivalent to him in that period. So that's why he was the most important. The most misunderstood, well, there's a whole other story, because what happened to Goleniewski after he defected and after he was whisked to safety in the United States is an extraordinary tragedy. It's the story of his own making, his own downfall, and also his persecution and the engineering of his downfall by the CIA's head of counterintelligence. And to put it bluntly, that man, James Jesus Angleton, drove Goleniewski literally insane.
So Tim, just to kind of place this character in some kind of context, I mean, you do an exhaustive amount of research trying to explain the origin of Goleniewski. Could you just, I know there's lots of versions here, but kind of give kind of a baseline, a little bit about where he's from and how he gets to the point where he defects to the West?
Sure. I mean, the 10-cent tour version is that Michael Goleniewski was he was born before the Second World War. He worked willingly or unwillingly for the Nazi regime during the Second World War, and then joined the Polish intelligence service. He was Polish. And he rose through the ranks of the Polish intelligence services throughout the early to mid 1950s and was highly decorated and very, very highly regarded. I mean, he ended up as one of the most senior Polish intelligence service officers, based in Warsaw, but traveling all over Europe, running spies on its behalf, spies who were at work inside Western democracies. In 1958, he has what can only be described as a Damascene conversion, and he realizes that the Soviet communist system, which has sustained him and indeed promoted him and given him all these riches, and they were riches comparatively, for all these years, was wrong. And he reached out, I think that's probably the kindest way of putting it, to the West. He approached the Americans and said, I would like to spy for you. I would like to provide you with information. He didn't give them his name or tell them where he was from. He used a code name, and his code name that he chose was a German word, Heckenschütz, which translates as sniper, hence the title Agent Sniper. And for 3 years, he delivered this cornucopia of material. I mean, an extraordinary volume of original documents, both from Polish intelligence, but also from the KGB, because he was simultaneously working for the Soviet KGB as its point man in Warsaw. He had access to all of this, and at great personal risk, he funneled this to the West.
I was interested in his code name, Agent Sniper, which he gives himself, as you said. And I wonder, just to kind of pose this question to you, do you think that it says anything about his personality or his view of himself and the role that he is playing? Or do you think it's just a random code name?
I think very little that Michael Goleniewski did was random. And the nature of the man's personality was he had a very high regard for his own abilities. In fairness, they were extraordinary. He was a fantastically intelligent and diligent and capable intelligence officer. Did he choose Heckenschütz sniper deliberately as some kind of indication of how he saw himself? It's entirely possible, but I can't tell you that for sure.
Wow. So Tim, he's obviously highly placed, knowledgeable. He has this conversion, and he says he's going to, spy for the West. How does he go about doing that? I mean, how does the West say, "Oh yeah, come on over"?
He sends a letter wrapped inside another letter, and the external envelope is hand-delivered, I think, to the US Embassy in Switzerland, which was kind of an outpost then, but that's how he did it. And inside, there was a covering note to the ambassador, and he said, inside is a letter which I want you to deliver to the FBI, to J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. And that letter said, I am an intelligence officer behind the Iron Curtain. I have access to all this information. I want to help. If you want to take me up on this offer, FBI, Mr. Hoover, then please, and this is classic Cold War spy stuff, please place a coded advert in the personal columns of a Frankfurt newspaper. And if I see that, I'll know that you're taking me up on the offer. That's how it began. Unfortunately for Goleniewski, that letter never reached the FBI. He'd sent it to Hoover and the FBI for a really important reason. His experience, his work for Soviet bloc intelligence services had alerted him to the fact that every US spy agency and most government agencies, with the sole exception of the FBI, had been penetrated by the KGB. So the letter he sends is an offer to the FBI, and he specifically doesn't want it to go to the CIA, which he knows has been penetrated. Where does that letter end up? With the CIA. And for the next almost 3 years, when he's working as an agent in place, undercover, inside Soviet bloc intelligence, he is run, unknowingly for him, by the CIA, the very agency he knows is penetrated by his Soviet bloc masters.
Right. So Rick.
Yeah, I just got it with the first mention, Chris.
Got it. All right. Okay.
We have a question from one of our viewers, Nancy Nallens, who says, can you say something about his conversion, about what made him change sides here, and kind of what his motivation was as best we know it?
It depends who you believe. Goleniewski was an extraordinary truth teller, but he was also an extraordinary liar. There's a good qualification for a spy.
Yes, exactly.
His version of events, and it's a subsequent version of events, is that he saw what was going on inside Poland and inside the KGB, and he realized that this was morally wrong. I got access to his Polish intelligence service file, which is vast. It's 1,100 pages. It tells a slightly different story. It, whilst admitting the incredible damage he did to Soviet bloc intelligence, it places the reason for his discontent and his going over to the other side, as they saw it, as a rather more personal thing. Goleniewski was a womanizer, and he had begun to have an affair outside of marriage with somebody, a school secretary in East Berlin. And when that all started kicking off, and he began to steal money from his intelligence service masters in Warsaw and Moscow, he funneled it to her, and he knew at that point he was on borrowed time.
Okay.
So I love all of John le Carré's spy novels, and reading this, I started to feel like this was the real life version. I mean, he's got a dead letter drop at the zoo in Berlin. There are people who have one-time codes, in a hollowed out lighter on the table. It's all the great spy tricks. But one thing that impresses me here in this story, and it's really talking primarily about the CIA, but perhaps also about a number of the spy services, is that you have a certain amount of technical expertise and great spycraft combined with complete incompetence, lapses in judgment, and failure to see the obvious. Those are themes that really run through this entire book.
Absolutely right. If we just back up slightly, at the time when Goleniewski first volunteers to spy for the West, the biggest thing that the West, specifically the US and the UK, were lacking was human intelligence. I got hold of internal CIA papers from the time, and they're quite damning. They said we really didn't have a clue what Moscow was up to, and everything we tried went very badly wrong. So they were desperate, or should have been desperate, for someone like Goleniewski to offer this treasure trove of intelligence material. How they handled it, I mean, bear in mind they lied to him for 3 years. He thought he was dealing with the FBI. He was actually being run by the CIA. Everything they did put him at risk. I mean, there's an extraordinary set of papers within both his Polish intelligence file and within CIA material in which the CIA didn't know his identity, but they'd worked out it was someone in Poland high up in the Polish intelligence services. He was spilling the beans on sexual entrapment of US personnel in Warsaw, in the embassy, and somehow this was passed to the very people who were running the Warsaw embassy, the US embassy in Warsaw. So it took about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a little longer, before news that they had a leak got back to Polish intelligence and got back to the KGB, and they began looking for the mole in their midst. And in just one of the many twists and turns of this, they assigned a particular officer to investigate and to track down the mole who was Goleniewski. The officer they assigned was Goleniewski, who was set to track himself down. And he writes this letter, still thinking it's to the FBI, saying, "You've got to be more careful, guys. They found out about me. Now, I think I've made it all right. But if this carries on, if they do find me, they're going to take me outside and they're going to prop me up against a wall and they're going to shoot me." Now, that should have been a warning to US intelligence to be a damn sight more careful. Unfortunately, it wasn't.
So Tim, I'd like to pick up on that because you say some really interesting things, earlier in the book about kind of the growing pains of the CIA and their operating techniques, which it surprised me quite a bit because that's not obviously the image that we have of them today.
Lost Chris there.
Oh,
hang on a second. We're having a bit.
Tim, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
He can hear me. You can't hear. So
okay.
Right.
Okay.
So
it's just me
it's just my question about. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of the early days of the CIA? Because again, that's not the perception or the image we have, and you talk about that. Really, it's very fascinating in the book about it's a new organization.
Yeah, I mean, the CIA was only formally created in 1947, and it was welded together from various mismatches of wartime and slightly post-war intelligence services, and there was a huge alphabet soup of them. It began in conflict. It was resented by the FBI. Hoover fought tooth and nail to stop it. it was resented by the armed services intelligence departments. It was fighting for territory right from the off. And although it had money thrown at it, and it was thrown at it in a big way, its record of success was dreadful for the first 7 or 8 years or even longer. And as I say, these internal hand-wringing analyses I found from the CIA, they're saying, it's all going terribly wrong. We've got to reorganize. We've got to do better. And they recognized that what they needed was what is known in spy jargon as human intelligence. In other words, someone like Goleniewski.
Rick, are you there with us? Well, okay. So I'll just pick up while Rick is getting that sorted. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on too is some of the people they work with. For example, lots of former German intelligence officials. Can you talk a little bit about Galen and his network and how the Americans kind of propped that up?
Yeah, after the war, after the CIA was formed, just before 47, 48, West Germany, what would become West Germany, it's spy central. It's the battleground. It's the central zone, the hot zone of the Cold War. And what the US needed was some kind of eye on what was going on just across the border in East Berlin, East Germany, and then further east in the Soviet bloc. And they essentially subcontracted this to a man called Reinhard Gehlen, who was a former Nazi intelligence officer who said, you know what, I've got a great intelligence network ready built. Why don't you just adopt me? And I'll work for you guys. Which
you just forget about my Nazi past. Yeah.
Right. I mean, well, that was fine. And they adopted and then funded Gehlen and his organization. It became, and this was, a common phrase, he was the CIA's seeing eye dog. In other words, the expression in the UK we call them guide dogs for the blind, but he was, and Gehlen was, the eyes and ears for Western intelligence, US intelligence in particularly, in West Germany. It was unfortunate, to put it mildly, that Gehlen had a very nasty habit of hiring ex-SS officers, including men who had committed wartime atrocities, without bothering to vet them, and didn't tell the CIA what he was doing, and then told the CIA to go to hell when they asked. It was a complete mess, and his organization from the off was penetrated by all these ex-Nazis who were easy meat for the Soviet intelligence services, saying, we can have you anytime we want on war crimes trials. Oh, unless maybe you want to work for us undercover. Right. So Gehlen's organization, what became West German intelligence, was penetrated by the Soviet Union, by Soviet intelligence. Everything that the US had went through Gehlen and his organization, and then went straight on to Moscow. It was chaotic.
Yeah, that's generous.
So Sniper is providing all of this intelligence to the CIA that they desperately need, so they don't have to completely rely on the Nazis who've been turned into double agents. And but he has an enemy, really, or an adversary inside the CIA, somebody you've mentioned before, James Jesus Angleton, who's the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, and he is highly skeptical. So why is he skeptical, and what effect does this have on how the intelligence is used, or what happens to Agent Sniper?
Angleton was fighting for supremacy inside the CIA at that point. there are rival divisions inside the CIA. It has a Soviet bloc intelligence division, and it has Angleton's counterintelligence staff. And Angleton wanted his staff, his counterintelligence staff, to be the supreme unit. In fairness to James Angleton, it was his job to be skeptical. If you're head of counterintelligence, your job is to doubt everything. He was, however, completely paranoid, even by the late 1950s. And he had his own view that the Soviet Union and the KGB in particular was an incredibly clever organization, quite true, and that it would hold out and did hold out, more intelligence jargon, dangles and provocations. And a dangle would be someone, a gift horse, if you like, someone offering something so wonderful that it's almost too good to be true. Well, in Angleton's view, if it was too good to be true, it wasn't true. And he took that as a position from day one, so that he was deeply skeptical, indeed hostile to Sniper, which is that's the only name they knew their source, their spy by, from day one, even as Sniper delivered case after case of really serious Soviet bloc spy rings in the UK, in Israel, inside West Germany, in Sweden, in Washington, D.C., Angleton still remained skeptical and hostile. And that ran up to the point in December 1960 when Sniper suddenly contacts the US and said, okay, the game's up for me. They're after me. They're coming to get me. I have to defect. And at that point, the CIA has to exfiltrate somehow Goleniewski from divided Berlin.
So Tim, what I'd like to do is, I mean, again, I was staggered by some of the stories in the book and some of the intelligence that he provided and some of the cases that Goleniewski was in. There are too many, and we want people to buy the book. But could you just give us one or two examples of some of the intelligence that he provided and what it led to, that people might,
Because I'm in the UK, I'll do the UK one first.
Sure.
We had a huge case here, just called the Portland Spy Ring, and essentially it was a couple of mid-level civil servants working inside naval research departments on the south coast of England. They were working for firstly Polish intelligence and then the KGB. Goleniewski, before he defected, identified them, or gave British intelligence enough to identify them. They were followed. That surveillance led to the uncovering of 3 previously unknown Soviet spy handlers who were really big fish. They were Morris and Lorna Cohen, who you saw on the screen just there, and another man called Gordon Lonsdale. Now, those weren't their real names. Sorry, Morris and Lorna Cohen were their real names. They were all operating under pseudonyms. It turned out they were all, the Cohens, who you just saw, had been on the run from the FBI for 10 years because they'd been part of the atom spy ring, the Rosenberg case. We had allowed them and all of this previously unknown ring to operate, stealing some of Britain's most important naval secrets, and then by extension the US and NATO naval secrets, and handing them over to Moscow. Goleniewski's information led to that being cracked, and all 5 of them, as it turned out, being arrested. Another one was a very senior MI6 officer who betrayed just about everything that he could, including the CIA's most expensive and important intelligence operation, the Berlin Tunnel. This MI6 officer, George Blake, he betrayed that from day one. These were some of the cases, and there were many, 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 many more that Goleniewski alerted the West to, and which resulted in successful prosecutions of the spies and the breaking of devastating Soviet spy rings in the West. Whatever else and whatever he did later, and I guess we'll get to that, his record of exposing Soviet bloc spies burrowed into Western democracies was unparalleled and extraordinarily valuable.
Rick, yeah.
We have a question. So you paint a very dramatic picture of the day that he actually comes over. It's in Berlin. The wall's not up yet, but he picks up his mistress and they make their way over to the American embassy. And this is the first time in which the Americans are going to discover who this guy is who's been sending them all this information. Was there, how close did he come to actually being found out, to being picked up? I know if they made a movie about it, they'd be chasing after him as he crossed over at Checkpoint Charlie, which didn't exist yet, of course. But how close did the KGB come to picking up on him and being able to capture him?
Pretty close. He fled Warsaw under the pretext of going to close down his spy rings and going to kiss goodbye to his East German mistress. He fled Warsaw on Christmas Day, 1960. He spent the time between then and January the 4th, when he defected, literally dodging surveillance agents from the Stasi and from Polish intelligence. And we know this because I've got this from Polish intelligence service files. They were tracking his movements. He was ducking and diving across Berlin. As you say, the wall hadn't gone up yet at that point, but Berlin was a pretty dangerous place. Germans had a word for it. It was called Agentensumpf, the swamp of spies. And it was pretty common for both sides, but particularly for the Soviet bloc side, to fight physically in the streets with their Western counterparts and to arrange kidnappings and to arrange assassinations. He had to get from East Berlin, where he was being pursued, he had to pick up his mistress, and he had to get to West Berlin, to the US embassy, where he knew he could get sanctuary, and he knew he was going to be expected because he put in a phone call saying, "Mayday, Mayday, I'm coming in." What was extraordinary to me, reading these two files in parallel, the CIA file and the Polish intelligence file, is that neither Goleniewski nor the CIA knew who they were dealing with. He thought he was still dealing with the FBI. The CIA had no idea who he was. They certainly had no idea who this pretty little brunette he arrived with was. And there was a comedy of errors inside the embassy, with them saying, "Well, who are you?" and him giving them his false identity card before he said, "Oh no, that's not my name. This is my real name, but you've got to get her out the room because she doesn't know my real name. She knows me by this name or that name, and she's going to be very upset if she finds out." And this plays out. It's not just dramatic; it is farcical.
Yeah.
However, he gets there. They sneak him inside the embassy, and they plan to exfiltrate him to the US as soon as they possibly can. But he hasn't finished talking. He just won't stop giving them information. And so although they planned to take him to the US 24 hours later, it was not until a week later, when he'd finally stopped talking, that they actually managed to put him on a plane under a false name and flew him to the east coast of the US.
Well, and I'm sure, Tim, given like how valuable his intelligence was, and I mean, just how influential he was, that of course the Americans should have been dancing in the streets to get him to the States. So, kind of how is he treated once he gets there?
I mean, they were absolutely ecstatic. The log from the case officer in West Berlin, who was a very senior CIA officer, is triumphant. I mean, this guy, the best spy we've ever had, has come in from the cold. We've got him safely. We've got him on a flight. He's now on his way to the States. They were ecstatic, and for the first year or so, he was treated incredibly well. He was put up in a safe house, first of all. Then he was given a very generous stipend. He was given compensation for all that he'd lost by leaving the Soviet bloc. He was given back pay for the 3 years he'd worked as an agent undercover. And the CIA even sponsored his marriage to his mistress in an Arlington courthouse. And they did so, firstly, under false names. So the man who got married didn't exist. It was just papers given by the CIA. And secondly, without checking whether Goleniewski was actually free to get married. He wasn't. He was still married to his wife back in Poland. And this was, if that's weird enough, and dear God it is, this was only the first of 2 bigamous marriages Goleniewski would make to the same woman.
Well, so he comes to the U.S. And there's lots of details to all this. It's a very rich book that Tim Tate has written, which is called, in the United States, Agent Sniper, and in the UK, The Spy Who Was Left Out in the Cold. And it really is quite there are circles within circles, games within games. It lives up to the old phrase, a wilderness of mirrors, that's used to describe the espionage landscape. So he comes to the U.S. He's still spewing information. They are tracking down other spies and closing down spy rings and alerting people that there are suspicions. There's a memo in '64 that he has made an unparalleled contribution to Western security and has been an accurate and reliable source of intelligence. Yet almost exactly as that is written, concurrent with that, he is cut off. He is, as you say, left in the cold. And further, the CIA, perhaps with some help from the Soviets, go to great efforts to discredit him. So what the heck happens to make that take place?
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It all happens in the period, all of this turns in the period of 1 year between summer 63 and summer 64. And as you say, for 2 years, he's been spilling his guts. He's been giving them spy after spy after spy, details of nuclear facilities behind the Iron Curtain, orders of battle, you name it, he handed it over. And at the same time, and he's been given lots of money. He's been given a job with the CIA as a consultant, and then he's been given health insurance. And also, the CIA is sponsoring a private bill in Congress to grant him citizenship, or rather grant him the right to apply for citizenship. So on the surface, everything looks fab and groovy, doesn't it? Suddenly, in the summer of '63, the CIA begins, it's not just to drop him, it begins to harass him. It begins to block congressional committees who are trying to get his testimony. It begins to play mind games. It constantly switches between the cover identities it has assigned him. It stops him applying for his citizenship because his citizenship bill is in a different name to his alien registration cards, so the two don't marry up. It really begins giving him the runaround. And you have to ask, why? Why would the CIA do this to the best spy it ever had? If you were to ask the CIA insofar as they would answer it, they would tell you this. They would say, Goleniewski went crazy. He started claiming that he wasn't Michael Goleniewski, Polish intelligence service officer. He started claiming that his real name was Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, the miraculously surviving Tsarevich from the assassinated Romanov royal family.
Oh, of course.
Of course. And insofar
the story gets more and more crazy as it goes along.
Oh, this has got the whole horror show of crazy. It's absolutely true. Goleniewski did claim that. It was entirely bogus, but he didn't claim that until spring 1964. The CIA began trying to destabilize his mind and to persecute him, and that's the only way I can put it, 9 months to a year earlier. So the question comes back again, why did the CIA do this? And to cut a long story short, it goes back to our friend James Jesus Angleton, who had got into bed with another defector, a rival defector, a man called Golitsyn, who was a con artist and a fantasist, but who convinced Angleton that he, Golitsyn, was the only true source of intelligence, the only true defector ever to come out of Russia or the Soviet bloc, and that any other defector was an imposter, a dangle, a provocation made up by the KGB to fool the CIA and lead it down false leads. That is what began the problems for Goleniewski. It did begin to unsettle him and to shake his mental foundations, but at the same time, he is to blame for this entirely bogus, fraudulent pretense to be the Tsarevich, the miraculously surviving Tsarevich from the Russian royal family, who had in fact been assassinated in 1918.
But Tim, when I was reading it, the one thing that struck me was, Goleniewski had provided actionable intelligence that led to positive results for British and U.S. intelligence agencies. There was proof, right, that this intelligence was valuable. And all of a sudden, Golitsyn,
a succession of very, very successful prosecutions. Yeah.
Yeah, but so then all of a sudden, Golitsyn is causing these questions and these doubts, and Angleton jumps on board that. But why aren't there other people saying, no, this is valuable stuff? That's what struck me.
There were, but Angleton was by that stage the preeminent voice inside the CIA. I mean, he had what's known as no-knock privileges. He could walk into the CIA director's office whenever he fancied it and sit down for a chat. No one else could. And Angleton was an extraordinarily secretive and purportedly all-knowing figure. He didn't speak Russian. He'd never run agents behind the Iron Curtain. But he said, no. I know all of this. Can't tell you how I know it, but you just have to trust me that I know all of this. It was both a con act and a self-deception on Angleton's part. And it didn't just destroy Goleniewski, it destroyed any number of career CIA officers and indeed a couple of subsequent defectors.
It does seem that one of the takeaways, my takeaways from this book is that there are a lot of con artists in the spy game. Maybe that's what's called on to be a spy. Maybe you have to be a con artist, and then you never ever. But there's so many people in your book who are double agents, triple agents. There's a Swedish colonel who's working for 4 different countries. There's it's just an amazing tangle of crazy stuff. I want to bring up a question. So Skip Cornett is champing at the bit here with a couple of versions of his question. He wants to know about the content of the intelligence, and I guess this would be the content of the intelligence that Sniper brings to the West. You know, is it just about intelligence and counterintelligence and spying on spies and that stuff, or what kind of what was the most important content of intelligence that he brought?
It's twofold. It's names, dates, and places. So names of spies, places where they're operating, the operations they're running against Western democracies. But he's also providing access to Soviet military documents. Again, I found a document from a CIA document in which, in one of his hugely long missives while he's working undercover, he provides details of Soviet nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons facilities, and nuclear weapons positioning, and orders of battle, and troop locations. What he's providing is the gold standard of military, nuclear, and intelligence material. There has never been anything like this in terms of scale and scope.
And if I can, Chris, if it's okay to just follow up on that, let's say the other thing that you really lay out in the book that I imagine must have really caught the CIA's attention is that he is sending the CIA all of the CIA documents that the KGB has gotten their hands on as a way of sort of saying, look, these guys have penetrated you so deeply. Here's all the documents they have that are yours. So maybe you want to take a look at them and try to figure out how they got them, because this is a huge loss for you.
Yeah, and bear in mind, Goleniewski thought he was sending that to the FBI, and he was saying, look at the CIA. We've got these CIA documents, which have turned up on my desk here in Warsaw. The CIA has a problem. FBI Director Hoover, please do something about this. He didn't realize it wasn't going anywhere near Hoover or the FBI. It was all landing back with the CIA. It is bizarre. And to pick up on something you said earlier about liars and deceptions, I was casting around when I was coming to the end of writing the book for, those little quotes you have at the front, like a frontispiece on a book. And I came across what I just thought was the perfect description. It's actually from a novel by Nelson DeMille. And it said, intelligence work is liar's poker played with fake chips and a stacked deck. And I think that just about sums it up.
So Tim, given the case that you lay out, was there ever any point where the CIA went, "Oh, gee, we really kind of blew this," or is this all? Have they just kind of conveniently forgotten about it? Did they, act to correct what they've done, or?
For Goleniewski, no. As you said, Rick, I found that their assessment of Goleniewski, written in '64, in which just praises him to the rafters, as does MI5 here. I found one of their letters praising Goleniewski and the incredible contribution he'd made. It never really got round to admitting that it had done him wrong. In terms of Angleton and the damage he did, and Goleniewski was merely one of the victims, yeah, it did. It commissioned a series of internal reports, which I got hold of, and which absolutely lacerate itself and lacerate Angleton for what he did. There will be, somewhere inside Langley, a whole bunch of other reports, CIA reports, admitting what they did to Goleniewski. I spent years trying to prize material out of Langley and indeed out of the agencies here in London. I got some, but in the end, they just said, that's your lot, go away. We know there is a vast amount more. Somewhere in that, there will be that oops moment, as you say. Oh, we really got this one wrong. But at the same time, and I have to keep re-emphasizing this, Goleniewski wasn't a victimless victim. He played his own serious part in his own downfall. And it's very easy, if you're the CIA knowing you screwed up, and they did, to say, yeah, but he was crazy. He was an absolute nut. And they did say that. They said that in terms. In fact, they warned the Secret Service in 1972, keep this guy away from anything because he's absolutely crazy. Right. And he was. By that point, he had completely lost his marbles. I don't know. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
That's I think that does. The phrase, we brought up the phrase earlier, wilderness of mirrors, which which is Angleton, I think, may have used, quoted T.S. Eliot to describe the spy landscape, but it could also refer to all the information and misinformation, documents from both sides that you as an author have to sift through to make sure you have it right. I guess another metaphor would be the Russian nesting dolls. How do you make sure you really have the final doll? That there's not one more inside, that there's not one more mirror you've missed that flips the whole story around. What kind of process did you go through to try to make sure you had the right story?
First of all, I'm absolutely sure there are many more Russian nesting dolls. There are many more documents which they just won't give me. For example, I asked MI5, our version of the FBI, I know you have a file on Goleniewski. I know that because I found pieces of it in other files. Please, can I have it? Now, we have no legal right in this country to ask for that, but I asked. And they sent me a very polite note back saying, yeah, we do hold a file on him, but no, you can't have it. Material's far too sensitive to let you have it. So, yeah, I'm absolutely confident there is going to be a lot more. And if they ever let me have it, then I'm sure there'll be a new edition of the book. But frankly, holding your breath is contraindicated. How do I make sure that what I've got is as close to the truth, or is certainly a truth? I do what a lot of writers working in my field do, old journalists, and I'm an old journalist. I put together this enormous comparative timeline. So I could tell you on any given day in January 1963, what Goleniewski said he was doing, what the CIA said he was doing, what Polish intelligence said he was doing, because they were looking for him. We didn't cover this, by the way, but he was sentenced to death in absentia by Poland, and they sent out agents for 8 years trying to track him down. So I have this extraordinarily detailed analytical timeline, and by comparing, well, that's what they said on that day, that's what he said on that, you can come to a version of the truth, or at least say, well, he says that, they say that, you make your mind up.
So picking up on that, Tim, though, are there questions, I'm sure there are, but I mean, are there some major questions that you feel you just couldn't get to the bottom of because you just couldn't access the information? I mean, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, two in particular. One a sort of professional thing, an intelligence thing. All of these prosecutions which resulted, all the breaking of these spy rings that resulted from Goleniewski's information take place outside the US. Sweden, Germany, Israel, Great Britain, France, all across the NATO countries and the NATO world. He had laid out chapter and verse about penetration of the CIA, of the State Department, of US government agencies and departments. Not a single prosecution. Now, I would deeply like to know what happened to that information and why that was never acted on. Am I going to find it? Unlikely, I think. I'm 66 now. By the time that's released, I'll be dead.
Yeah.
The second thing that I wrote this right at the end of the book, that I felt that I was missing. I had access to Goleniewski's own writings, and they were huge. I mean, we're talking reams and reams and reams of this stuff. And I knew a great deal about his mistress, his wife, who he married twice, bigamously, under different names. And I knew about his daughter, because his wife, mistress, gave birth to a daughter. But what I didn't have, and I still don't have, is a sense of Goleniewski as a father and a husband. Mm-hmm. So I reached out, I tracked down his daughter. She doesn't go by that name or any of the names and cover names he used anymore. But I found her, and I sent her letter after letter. I hand-delivered letters. I emailed her, and I got absolutely no response. So in the end, I tracked down her phone number, her cell phone number, and I rang her. And I explained what I was doing, and I said, I just want to know about your dad as your dad. I've been a journalist for 40-odd years. I don't think I've ever had the phone put down on me quite so quickly. He said, please, I'm not talking to you. Please don't call me again. Click.
Wow. I think I have time to slip one more in, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just to bring us up to today, which is, what lessons does this story have for us today? Because if there's all this spying and counter-spying and misinformation going on in 1958, 1960, 1962, there's at least as much or 10 times as much today. What do you think we should take away from this story in 2022?
I asked exactly the same question. Is this just a piece of Cold War curiosity, a fascinating, weird, twist and turny story from the heart of the Cold War, or is there something that matters now? And the answer is that, yeah, there is something that matters now. And other than the fact there are mole spies, Soviet bloc spies, he tried to identify inside British and American intelligence and governments. One of the things he tried to get across from his earliest days working undercover and then afterwards was the extent of the KGB's disinformation operations. He was desperate for the West to understand how much money, time, and effort the KGB put into creating disinformation. The techniques may have changed slightly from the 1950s and early 1960s, but what we are seeing today in the second decade, third decade of the 21st century is exactly that. The Soviet Union may not exist anymore, the KGB may not exist anymore, but Russia and the FSB, which is the KGB's successor, are doing exactly what Goleniewski tried to alert the West to 60 years ago. The actual tools may have changed slightly. The rest is exactly the same, and we haven't learnt that lesson.
Well, Tim Tate, thank you so much for helping us learn a few lessons today on History Happy Hour. And I want to just call out your book one more time. In Britain, The Spy Who Was Left Out in the Cold. In America, Agent Sniper. They're both by Tim Tate. It's one book. It is by Tim Tate. It is, it's
it has many illnesses, just like Goleniewski.
Many marriages as Goleniewski had, but they're fantastic. It's I can't get the number right, but it's a fantastic book, and you were terrific. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tim.
You're very kind, and thank you for having me.
All right. Good luck with the book.
It's great.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. Yes. Best of luck with this one and the next one, which we understand won't have quite as many difficult names to pronounce in it, but we won't say anything more about that.
But almost as many twists and turns.
Oh, good.
Oh,
Then definitely come back.
excellent. We look forward to next week. Happy Hour is still operating, comes out, and based on recent evidence, it will be. Please join us. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, Chris, are you still there? Am I still here?
I am.
I've had
You're still there,
It's
yeah.
been kind of going in and out for me, but yeah, it sounds like it all was audible and visual to everybody else. So that was fun, terrific. And
Absolutely.
Chris,
It's
tell
very
us
fun.
about next week's guest, which is Peter Hart and his
Yes.
book Burning Steel.
I'm really excited to have Peter back. He was on the show earlier talking about a book about a Royal Artillery Regiment during World War II, but this one now kind of picks up the story. He's working through all the branches, and this is about a tank regiment at war during World War II. Again, kind of the whole period of the war for this one regiment. It's a very intimate look at armored warfare in World War II. Fascinating study, heavy emphasis on the stories of the men who were there, so should be good.
And Peter, of course, is the longtime oral historian at the Imperial War Museum, and just terrific recorder of history and a relator of history. So we really look forward to having him back.
Exactly.
And everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again to the Wiscasset Public Library for their free Wi-Fi. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Thanks to you all. We appreciate your being here and learning and watching this stuff with us.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.